The air in the Ozark Mountains of 1803 held a different quality, thicker, heavier, and ancient. It was an air that clung to secrets, swallowing sound and hope alike. For a lone French trapper named Louis Blanchett, it was simply a wilderness, a challenging but honest adversary. He had tracked a prime silver fox for 2 days, deeper into a forgotten hollow than any map would dare to chart. The trees here grew in unnatural silence, their branches twisted into skeletal claws against the bruised twilight sky. He was about to give up the chase when he stumbled into a clearing, the abruptness of it jarring his senses. Before him stood the ruin of a small cabin, its bones picked clean by years of harsh seasons. But it wasn't the derelict structure that froze the blood in his veins. It was the well. A crude circle of stone, capped with a rotting wooden lid, it sat in the center of the clearing like a festering wound on the land. An inexplicable and primal dread, cold and sharp, pierced through his exhaustion. He felt watched, not by any forest creature but by the clearing itself, by the suffocating stillness. He approached the well, his moccasins making no sound on the packed earth. With the butt of his rifle, he nudged the lid. It crumbled into damp splinters, revealing a circle of perfect, impenetrable blackness. A faint, foul odor, like damp soil and something metallic, something vaguely biological, rose from the depths. He leaned over, peering into the abyss, and what the darkness showed him in return would shatter his mind. He saw a shape, pale and distorted by the water, something that was almost human but terribly, horribly wrong. It wasn't a body. It was a configuration, a macabre arrangement of things that should never be joined. He recoiled with a strangled cry, scrambling backward, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Louis Blanchett fled that hollow and never returned. He would live for another 30 years, a haunted man who spoke in whispers and never again ventured into the deep woods. When pressed, he would only say that he had looked into the throat of hell itself. He had stumbled upon the final, horrifying chapter of the Holloway family and the forbidden history of their cursed well. To understand the horrifying silence that greeted Louis Blanchett, we must rewind the clock 4 years, to the hopeful spring of 1799. The Holloway family, Jedediah, his wife Martha, their 16-year-old son Elias, 10-year-old daughter Sarah, and the infant Samuel were pioneers, chasing the promise of untamed land and a life carved by their own hands. Jedediah was a stern, God-fearing man, his hands calloused and his will forged from iron. He saw the untamed Ozark wilderness not as a threat, but as a challenge issued by Providence itself. He had purchased a tract of land, sight unseen, in a remote hollow that local land agents spoke of with a curious reluctance. They called it Shadow Creek Hollow, though no creek was marked on any map. It was a name born of folklore, a place settlers tended to skirt around. But Jedediah Holloway was not a man swayed by the whispers of superstitious folk. He saw only virgin timber, rich soil, and the isolation he craved to build his own personal kingdom, free from the corrupting influence of burgeoning settlements. Martha, a quieter soul, was more attuned to the subtle language of the land. As their wagon groaned into the hollow for the first time, a profound unease settled upon her. The place was beautiful, yet its beauty felt predatory. The valley was unnaturally quiet. The typical chorus of birdsong and insect chatter was conspicuously absent. The very air felt heavy, expectant. She watched her children, Sarah and Elias, explore the edge of the woods, their youthful exuberance feeling like a transgression against the solemnity of the place. She voiced her concerns to Jedediah, speaking of a stillness in the air that felt watchful. He dismissed her fears with a brusque wave of his hand, attributing her anxiety to the long journey. "This is our promised land, Martha," he declared, his voice booming with a certainty that left no room for debate. "Here, we will put down roots so deep no force on earth can move us." It was a promise that would prove to be a horrifying, macabre prophecy. The roots they were about to put down would lead not to nourishment, but to a forbidden darkness that had been slumbering beneath the soil for time immemorial. The first task was shelter, and Jedediah and Elias worked from sunup to sundown, their axes ringing out in the oppressive silence of the hollow. The cabin rose slowly, a testament to their grit and determination. But the second and most vital task was water. A reliable source of clean water was the lifeblood of any homestead, the difference between survival and a slow, agonizing demise. Martha, raised with the old ways, suggested they search for a natural spring or use a dowsing rod, a forked branch from a willow tree, to let the land guide them. She believed that water was a gift from the earth and one had to ask for it respectfully. Jedediah scoffed at the notion. He called it pagan nonsense, a foolish ritual unbefitting of a devout family. God gave me a strong back and a shovel, woman, he'd said, his voice laced with condescending pride. That is all the magic I require. He chose a spot for the well himself, not through any geological intuition but through sheer convenience. It was a flat, open space roughly 50 yards from the cabin, a location that would require the least effort to haul buckets back and forth. Martha felt a familiar chill as he marked the spot, a deep, instinctual wrongness she couldn't articulate. The ground there seemed different. The grass was thinner, and the soil beneath had a pale, almost sterile quality. She pleaded with him one last time to reconsider, to at least walk the property, but his pride was now a fortress. He had made his decision. The digging began. For days, the rhythmic thud of the pickaxe and the scrape of the shovel were the only sounds in the hollow. The work was brutal. After digging through a few feet of topsoil, they hit a layer of dense clay-like earth, the color of old bruises. Below that, they encountered strange, smooth stones, dark and cold to the touch, unlike the common field stone of the region. They were almost perfectly round, like massive, petrified eggs. Elias complained that touching them made the hairs on his arms stand up, a sensation he couldn't explain. Jedediah, ever practical, simply tossed them aside, growing more frustrated with each passing day. The hole deepened, becoming a stark, black pit in the earth, a gaping mouth that seemed to exhale a palpable cold, even under the sweltering summer sun. On the seventh day of digging, Jedediah's shovel struck something that wasn't stone. It was a layer of black, peaty soil, unnaturally damp and fibrous, shot through with what looked like thick, dark hair. The smell that wafted up was ancient and foul, a scent of decay that was both earthy and disturbingly unfamiliar. Elias recoiled, gagging, but Jedediah, determined to the point of obsession, pressed on. He ordered his son back into the pit, and together they shoveled out the strange, fibrous earth. Beneath it they found not bedrock but a series of flat gray stones arranged in a deliberate circular pattern. It was unmistakable. This was not a natural formation. It was something constructed, something ancient and buried, something that had been intentionally sealed away. Martha, bringing them a pail of water, peered down and gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Jedediah, stop," she implored, her voice trembling. "This is unholy ground. This is a grave." Jedediah's face was a mask of grim determination, his eyes wild with a feverish light. He had invested too much sweat and pride to be deterred by a woman's fears or a pile of old stones. "It is a well," he snarled, his voice a low growl, "and I will have water from it." With a mighty heave, he used his iron pry bar to break the stone seal. The moment the first stone shifted, a low groaning sound echoed from the depths, as if the earth itself was exhaling a long-held breath. A gust of frigid, foul-smelling air rushed out of the hole, extinguishing their lantern and plunging them into darkness. For a moment there was only the sound of their own ragged breathing. Then another sound, faint but unmistakable, rose from the blackness below, a soft, rhythmic dripping. It was the sound of water. Jedediah let out a triumphant roar, his victory cry swallowed by the hollow's oppressive silence. He had conquered the earth. He had found his water. But as Martha stood frozen at the edge of the pit, staring into the abyss her husband had just violated, she knew with chilling certainty that he hadn't found a source of life. He had broken the lock on a forbidden door. The water they drew from the well was unlike any they had ever known. It was astonishingly, unnaturally cold, even on the hottest days of August. When held in a glass, it was crystal clear, yet it seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. And then there was the taste. It was clean, yet it left a faint, almost imperceptible metallic aftertaste on the tongue, a mineral tang that was both strange and vaguely unsettling. Jedediah declared it the finest, purest water in all the territory, a divine reward for his perseverance. He drank it deeply, forcing it upon his family as a symbol of his triumph. But from the very first day, the livestock refused to touch it. The horses would shy away from the trough, their eyes rolling in fear. The milk cow went dry within a week. Jedediah, in his stubborn pride, dismissed it as the animals being finicky, unused to the local water. But Martha and Elias knew it was something more. They saw the instinctual terror in the animals' eyes. They felt it too. The well water seemed to change the very atmosphere of the homest. A perpetual chill lingered in the cabin, a damp cold that seeped into their bones and could not be dispelled by the hearth fire. Their sleep became a landscape of disturbing, disjointed nightmares. Martha dreamt of being submerged in icy, black water, her lungs filling with mud as pale, formless things swam around her in the dark. Elias had recurring visions of the round, black stones from the well, dreaming they were not stones at all, but the eyes of something immense and ancient, buried and dreaming beneath their home. Even Jedediah's iron will began to show cracks. His sleep was punctuated by violent thrashing and muttered, incoherent warnings. Only little Sarah seemed unaffected. In fact, she seemed drawn to the well. She would spend hours sitting at its edge, her small legs dangling over the side, humming a strange, meandering tune with no discernible melody. She would drop pebbles into the darkness and wait, her head cocked as if listening for a response. When Martha would try to call her away, Sarah would look up with a placid, unnerving smile and say, "I'm just talking." This was the beginning. The curse of the Holloway well did not announce itself with a thunderclap or a demonic roar. It arrived in a whisper, in the taste of cold water and the melody of a child's disturbing new song. As summer bled into a cool, melancholic autumn, Sarah's fixation with the well deepened into a disturbing obsession. Her solitary talks evolved into lively, one-sided conversations. She gave her unseen companion a name, the man in the water. At first, Martha and Elias tried to rationalize it as the lonely fantasy of a child in an isolated world. Children have imaginary friends, they told themselves. It was normal, but the details Sarah provided were anything but normal. "He's very tall," she would say at the dinner table, pushing her food around her plate. "And he's so cold. He says it's dark where he is, and he's been thirsty for a very long time." Her descriptions were delivered with a chilling, matter-of-fact tone that belied her age. She claimed his voice didn't sound like a real voice, but more like rocks scraping together under the ground. The imaginary friend was not a playmate. He was an entity, and his reported whispers began to take on a sinister, persuasive edge. Sarah started repeating his requests. "The man in the water wants one of my dolls," she said one afternoon, holding up her favorite cornhusk figure. "He says he'll keep it safe for me down in the cold." Martha, horrified, forbade it, snatching the doll away. That night the doll vanished from the mantelpiece. They found it 2 days later, floating in the well bucket, its simple yarn hair matted with the same black, fibrous muck they had dug up from the pit. A wave of ice-cold dread washed over Martha. This was no longer a child's fantasy. Something was communicating with her daughter. Something was reaching out from the forbidden darkness they had unleashed. Jedediah, when confronted with the sodden doll, flew into a rage. But his anger was a brittle shield for a fear he could not admit. He wasn't angry at Sarah. He was angry at the well. He stormed out of the cabin, shouting into the night that no devil from a pit would have dominion over his household. He sealed the well with a heavy wooden lid and rolled a massive stone on top of it, an act of defiance against the encroaching darkness. But it was far too late. The door had been opened, and the thing that had been waiting was already inside their home, whispering its cold secrets into the ear of their most vulnerable child. Jedediah's act of sealing the well did not silence the entity. It only seemed to anger it. The subtle, creeping dread that had haunted the edges of their lives now began to manifest in more tangible, horrifying ways. The nights became an ordeal of psychological torment. Unexplained sounds plagued the cabin, a soft, wet scraping against the outer walls, the sound of pebbles being dropped, one by one, onto the roof, and most disturbingly, a low, guttural humming that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath their feet. It was a sound that vibrated deep in their bones, a resonant frequency of pure malevolence. Elias, lying awake on his straw mattress, would listen to it for hours, his body rigid with terror. It sounded chillingly like a distorted bass version of the aimless tune Sarah hummed by the well. The family's psychological state began to fray. Jedediah, once a pillar of unshakable resolve, became a hollow-eyed, paranoid wreck. He took to patrolling the property at night, his long rifle cradled in his arms, his eyes darting into the shadows. He would mutter about trespassers, about thieves trying to steal his water, his accusations growing more frantic and unhinged. He stopped sleeping, and his waking hours were fueled by a volatile mixture of fear and rage. Martha, meanwhile, was consumed by a quiet, gnawing terror. She began to waste away, her skin growing pale and translucent, her eyes sinking deeper into their sockets. She started hanging charms and crosses over every door and window, her faith devolving into a desperate, frantic superstition. The most horrifying transformation, however, was in Sarah. She became sullen and withdrawn. She stopped speaking to anyone except in short, cryptic whispers. She would sit in a corner of the cabin, her back to the family, rocking back and forth for hours. She had begun to draw, using charcoal from the fire on scraps of birch bark. Her creations were the stuff of nightmares, crude, stick-figure representations of her family, all of them with excess for eyes, being pulled down into a large black circle by a towering, featureless figure. In every drawing, the figure's long, spindly arms were reaching up from the black maw, its grip like a cage. The curse was no longer just in the water. It was in their minds, methodically dismantling their sanity piece by macabre piece. As the Ozark hills burned with the colors of late autumn, a stranger arrived at the Holloway homestead. He was a traveling preacher named Silas Kane, a circuit rider who brought the word of God to the isolated families of the frontier. He was a gaunt, weathered man with eyes that had seen both the piety and the depravity of the human soul. He had heard rumors in the distant settlements of a family that had settled in the forbidden Shadow Creek Hollow, and he felt it was his duty to seek them out. The moment he rode into the clearing, a feeling of profound spiritual sickness washed over him. The very air felt tainted, heavy with a silent, waiting malice. He saw Jedediah standing guard near the cabin, his rifle held at the ready, his eyes burning with a paranoid fire. The preacher dismounted slowly, raising a hand in peace. "The Lord's blessings upon this house," Silas called out, his voice sounding small and fragile in the oppressive quiet. Jedediah stared at him, his expression a mixture of suspicion and fear. "We have the Lord's blessing already," he said, his voice raspy. "We have the finest water in the territory. We need nothing from you." The preacher's eyes were drawn to the well, to the massive stone that sat atop its lid. He felt a coldness emanating from it, a spiritual vacuum that chilled him to the bone. "I have traveled these hills for 20 years, my friend," Silas said, his voice soft but firm. "The old ones, the tribes that came before us, they had names for places like this. They called them hollow grounds or soul leaders. They are places where the earth is thin, where things that are meant to sleep are easily disturbed." He took a step closer. "That well, the water you have found, it is not a blessing. It is a blight. I can feel it. You must abandon this place. You must flee before it consumes you all." At the mention of the well, Jedediah's face contorted into a mask of rage. He saw the preacher not as a savior but as another thief, another envious outsider trying to take what was his. "Get off my land," he screamed, raising his rifle. "Devil talker, you are not welcome here." Silas Kane, seeing the madness in Jedediah's eyes, knew there was nothing more he could do. He backed away slowly, mounted his horse, and rode away, the feeling of profound evil clinging to him like a shroud. As he left the hollow, he said a prayer for the family, but in his heart, he knew they were already lost. He was the last outsider to see the Holloway family alive. The preacher's visit shattered Jedediah's last tether to reason. He saw Silas Kane's warning not as an act of concern, but as a confirmation of his deepest paranoia. The world coveted his prize, his perfect water, and would stop at nothing to take it. He became a jailer in his own home. He boarded up most of the windows, plunging the cabin into a perpetual twilight. No one was allowed outside without his permission, which was never granted. The homestead, once a symbol of their independence, was now a claustrophobic, horror-filled prison. The family was now completely severed from the outside world, left to marinate in the well's insidious influence. The entity, the man in the water, no longer needed to whisper solely to Sarah. Its presence was now a palpable force within the cabin, a silent, unseen member of the family. Its malevolence seeped into their very thoughts. Jedediah's paranoia festered into violent delusions. He would spend hours staring at the stone-covered well, carrying on heated, one-sided arguments with it. At other times, he would sit at the table, polishing his rifle, and speak to it of the sacrifices that were required to protect the family's claim, his voice a low, conspiratorial monotone. His family became his enemies, potential traitors who might conspire with outsiders to steal his treasure. Martha, frail and terrified, tried to reason with him, to remind him of the man he once was. Her pleas were met with vacant stares or sudden, explosive bursts of fury. He accused her of being in league with the preacher, of wanting to abandon the blessing God had given them. Elias, seeing his mother's desperation and his father's descent into madness, felt a terrible weight settle upon his young shoulders. He was no longer a boy. He was a witness to the complete and horrifying dissolution of his world. He tried to protect his mother and sister, to create a small pocket of sanity in the suffocating darkness, but it was like trying to cup water in his hands. The horror was everywhere in his father's mad eyes, in his sister's chilling drawings, and in the constant, oppressive cold that emanated from the sealed, silent well. The first snow of winter fell, blanketing the Ozarks in a shroud of white and deepening the family's isolation. It was during this cold, desperate time that the baby, Samuel, fell ill. It was not a common sickness of the frontier, not a fever, not a cough, not a pox. It was a slow, silent, and macabre fading. The infant simply began to weaken. He refused to feed, a profound lethargy took hold of him, and his cries became thin, pitiful whimpers. His skin grew cold and pale, taking on a waxy, translucent quality. The life seemed to be draining out of him, day by agonizing day. Martha, frantic with a mother's terror, tried every remedy she knew, herbal poultices, prayers, teas, but nothing worked. The baby continued his silent, inexorable decline. Jedediah watched the process with a detached, unnerving calm. He showed no grief, no concern. Instead, his eyes held a strange, calculating glint. He would stand over the baby's cradle for long periods, not as a father but as a scientist observing a grim experiment. One evening, as Martha wept by the fire, cradling her dying son, Jedediah spoke, his voice devoid of all emotion. "He is being called," he said softly. "The giver of the water requires a gift, a tithe. It is only fair. The water gives us life, and we must give something in return." Martha looked up at him, her face a mask of horror and disbelief. The man standing before her was a stranger, his mind utterly poisoned by the thing in the well. "What are you saying, Jedediah?" she whispered, clutching Samuel tighter. "That is our son." Jedediah's eyes seemed to look right through her. "It is the way of it," he continued, as if reciting a sacred text. "The earth gives and the earth must take. To refuse the gift is to invite a greater curse. He is small. The giver will be pleased with such a pure offering." Elias, who had been listening from the shadows, felt a cold dread unlike any he had ever known. His father was not just mad. He was an apostle of a new, horrifying religion, with the well as its altar and his family as the intended sacrifice. The baby's sickness wasn't a tragedy to him. It was an opportunity. The horrifying truth of her husband's words settled upon Martha like a physical blow, extinguishing the last embers of hope in her soul. She saw the abyss that had opened between them, the unbridgeable chasm carved by the well's influence. Her husband was gone, replaced by a monstrous puppet of the entity they had unearthed. From that moment, her focus shifted from saving her family to orchestrating an escape. Survival, for what was left of her children, was the only thing that mattered. She began to act the part of the submissive wife, nodding along to Jedediah's insane ramblings, feigning belief in his dark covenant. She needed to lull his paranoia, to make him believe she was a convert to his macabre faith. Secretly, she began to prepare. While Jedediah was on his obsessive patrols around the well, she would squirrel away what little they had: a handful of dried meat, a small sack of cornmeal, a tinderbox. She whispered her plan to Elias late one night, the words barely audible over the sound of the wind rattling the cabin. They would wait for the next snowstorm, for a night when the visibility was near zero. They would slip out while Jedediah slept, taking Sarah and the ailing Samuel, and run. They would run until they left the hollow and its curse far behind them. Elias agreed without hesitation. The hope of escape, however slim, was a lifeline in a sea of despair. He watched his father with new eyes, not as a parent but as a captor, a monster that had to be outsmarted. The tension in the cabin became a living, breathing thing. Every meal was a silent ordeal, every glance fraught with unspoken meaning. Martha's feigned compliance, Elias' watchful silence, Sarah's vacant rocking, and Jedediah's simmering, delusional madness created a horrifying tableau of a family on the absolute brink of annihilation. They were all playing a deadly game, waiting for the weather to turn, praying they could make their move before Jedediah decided the time was right to make his offering. The Holloway cabin was no longer a home. It was a powder keg, and the fuse was burning rapidly shorter with every passing, terrifying hour. Sarah's connection to the well had evolved beyond mere communication. She had become its oracle, its prophet of doom. She no longer drew her disturbing pictures. Instead, she had started to build things. Using twigs, stones, and strips of leather, she would construct bizarre, intricate effigies. They were unsettling, abstract sculptures, but their meaning became horribly clear one afternoon. Elias found her in a corner, humming her dissonant tune, putting the finishing touches on her latest creation. It was a crude but unmistakable replica of their cabin. Beside it, she had built a small circle of stones, a miniature well, and placed around the well were 4 small stick figures. A larger, more menacing figure, made from a dark, gnarled piece of root, lay beside them. As Elias watched, Sarah picked up a 5th tiny stick figure, one wrapped in a scrap of white linen to represent a swaddled baby. With a slow, deliberate movement, she dropped the tiny figure into the stone circle. Then she looked up at Elias, her eyes wide and placid, yet seeming to hold an ancient, chilling knowledge. "Soon," she whispered, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. "The man in the water is hungry. Father says he must be fed soon. He says the little one will go first." The casual, matter-of-fact way she spoke of her baby brother's impending doom was more terrifying than any scream. Elias felt the blood drain from his face. The timeline had been moved up. His father's abstract ramblings about a tithe had solidified into a concrete, imminent plan. The entity in the well was no longer just influencing them. It was directing them, using his father as its hand and his sister as its voice. He grabbed the Macabre model and smashed it to pieces, but the image was seared into his mind. He ran to his mother, relaying Sarah's horrifying prophecy. The look on Martha's face was one of absolute, soul-crushing defeat. The snowstorm they had been waiting for had not yet come. Time had run out. Their desperate plan for escape was now a frantic, last-ditch effort for survival. They would have to leave that very night, storm or no storm, before Jedediah's madness culminated in an act of unthinkable horror. The curse was demanding its first victim. The night was moonless and suffocatingly dark, a perfect canvas for their escape. Jedediah, exhausted from days of sleepless paranoia, had finally succumbed to a heavy, snoring slumber by the cold hearth. It was now or never. Moving like ghosts in their own home, Martha and Elias began their final, silent preparations. Martha wrapped the frail, whimpering Samuel in every blanket she could find, her hands trembling so violently she could barely tie the knots. Elias gathered their meager provisions and slung his father's spare powder horn and shot pouch over his shoulder. He also took a heavy iron skillet, not for cooking, but as a crude weapon, a last line of defense against his own father. The final, most difficult task was Sarah. She was awake, sitting on her cot, watching them with those unnervingly calm eyes. When Martha reached for her, Sarah pulled back, shaking her head slowly. "We can't," she whispered, her voice laced with a fear that was not for herself. "The man in the water will be angry. He'll follow us. He sees everything." A desperate argument conducted in terrified whispers ensued. Martha pleaded, begged, and cajoled, but Sarah was immovable, a willing captive of the entity that held her mind. She believed that leaving was a far greater transgression than staying. She truly believed her father was doing what was necessary. As the argument grew more frantic, a floorboard creaked loudly under Elia's shifting weight. In the corner, Jedediah's snoring stopped. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. Every sound, the pounding of their hearts, the whistling of the wind outside, was magnified 100-fold. They stood frozen, waiting, praying he would roll over and fall back asleep. Instead, they heard the slow, deliberate scrape of a chair, and then the unmistakable, metallic click of a rifle hammer being cocked in the darkness. "Going somewhere, Martha." Jedediah's voice was a low, chillingly calm rumble that cut through the blackness. The escape was over. The trap had been sprung. Their quiet rebellion had been discovered, and the jailer was now awake, armed, and ready to pass his horrifying judgment. The scene that unfolded in the dim firelight was a tableau from a madman's dream. Jedediah stood before them, his gaunt frame silhouetted against the dying embers, the long rifle held loosely in his hands. But his eyes held no rage, no fury. Instead, they were filled with a profound, sorrowful disappointment, the look of a prophet whose disciples had lost their faith. "You would steal from the giver," he said, his voice soft with a terrible sadness. "You would rob the earth of its rightful due. After all it has given us, this perfect water, this sacred ground, you do not understand the covenant." He took a step forward, and Martha instinctively shielded her children. "I tried to protect you," he continued, his gaze distant. "I tried to make you see the beauty of the arrangement, a small price for such a grand blessing, a small sacrifice to ensure our prosperity." It was then that Elias and Martha realized the full, horrifying extent of his delusion. He did not see his actions as murder. In his shattered mind, this was an act of holy appeasement, a sacred transaction. He was not a monster, he was a priest, and the well was his God. He believed with every fiber of his being that he was saving them. He raised the rifle, not pointing it at them, but gesturing toward the door. "The time for waiting is over. Your lack of faith has forced my hand. We will go to the altar now, all of us. We will present our gifts and beg for the giver's forgiveness." The casual way he spoke of an altar and gifts confirmed their worst fears. He intended to perform his horrifying ritual tonight, with the entire family as participants and victims. There was no escape. The cabin was a sealed tomb, and its keeper was leading them to their execution. The choice was no longer about flight. It was about a final, desperate act of defiance against the encroaching, inevitable horror. What happens next is a testament to the human spirit's will to survive, even in the face of unimaginable darkness. And if you find these forbidden histories as compelling as we do, consider subscribing to the channel. The stories that were meant to be forgot are often the ones that have the most to teach us. As Jedediah herded them toward the door, a primal instinct for survival surged through Elias. He knew with absolute certainty that if they stepped outside, they were dead. He met his mother's eyes across the dim room, and in that fleeting glance, a silent, desperate understanding passed between them. Martha, holding the whimpering Samuel, took a small, stumbling step, a diversion. At the same moment, Elias lunged. He didn't go for his father, he went for the hearth. With a desperate cry, he grabbed the heavy iron poker from its hook and swung it wildly at the single lantern lighting the room. The poker connected with a crash of shattering glass, plunging the cabin into absolute, disorienting darkness. Kerosene sloshed and ignited from the dying embers, and a line of fire briefly illuminated the chaos. Jedediah roared in surprise and fury. Elias didn't wait. He scrambled toward where he last saw his mother, grabbing her arm. "The window," he hissed, pulling her toward the back of the cabin, toward one of the small windows Jedediah hadn't fully boarded up. As they moved, a deafening blast filled the small space, the rifle discharging in the dark. The musket ball ripped through the wall just inches from Elias' head, showering them with splinters. Panic and adrenaline fueled their movements. Elias used the poker to smash at the boards covering the window, the wood groaning and splintering. Outside, the wind howled, a symphony for their frantic escape. Behind them, Jedediah thrashed in the dark, cursing, trying to reload his single-shot rifle. Another crack and the boards gave way. "Go!" Elias screamed, shoving his mother toward the opening. Martha, clutching the baby, squeezed through the narrow frame, tumbling out into the snow and biting wind. Elias was right behind her. He paused for a fraction of a second, looking back into the pitch-black cabin. "Sarah," he yelled. "Come on." From the darkness, her voice came back, small and full of an eerie calm. "No," she said. "Father needs me. The man in the water is waiting." The finality in her voice was a chilling death sentence. There was no time. Elias jumped from the window, his heart breaking, and ran after his mother into the freezing, unforgiving night. The flight from the cabin was a desperate, stumbling ordeal through the frigid darkness. The thin layer of snow offered little light, and the Ozark wilderness, which had once promised them a new life, was now a treacherous maze of unseen roots and grasping branches. Martha, weakened by weeks of terror and starvation, struggled to keep pace, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The baby, Samuel, was eerily silent in her arms, his life force fading in the biting cold. Elias led the way, his mind a maelstrom of terror, grief, and a sliver of desperate hope. Every snap of a twig behind them, every moan of the wind through the trees, sounded like his father's footsteps closing in. He knew Jedediah wouldn't give up. His father was a hunter, and this was his land. They were his prey. After what felt like an eternity of running, Martha collapsed, her strength completely gone. She fell to her knees in the snow, her body shaking uncontrollably. "I can't, Elias," she sobbed, her voice a broken whisper. "Leave me, save yourself, save the baby." Elias refused. He pulled her to her feet, half carrying, half dragging her onward. He knew that stopping meant death. He looked for any sign of shelter, any place to hide from the monster that was his father and the elements that were just as deadly. He spotted a shallow overhang, a small rock shelter carved into the side of a hill, barely large enough to shield them from the wind. He guided his mother and brother inside, huddling together for warmth against the cold stone. They were exposed, exhausted, and hopelessly lost. From their hiding spot, they could just make out the faint, flickering light of their cabin in the distance, a single point of orange against the oppressive black of the hollow. As they watched, they saw a figure emerge from the cabin. It was Jedediah. He was carrying a lantern, and he held it high, casting a swinging pool of light as he began to methodically search, his movements calm and purposeful. And then a second, smaller figure emerged from the cabin to stand beside him. It was Sarah. She pointed, not in their direction, but toward the well. Jedediah nodded, and together they began to walk toward the dark circle of stones, the lantern light guiding their way to a horrifying, prearranged destination. Huddled in the rock shelter, shivering from cold and terror, Martha and Elias could only watch the horrifying pantomime unfold in the distant lantern light. They saw their father and sister reach the well. Jedediah handed the lantern to Sarah, who held it aloft like an acolyte at a profane ritual. Jedediah then bent down and, with what seemed like superhuman strength, heaved the massive stone off the well's lid. He pried open the wooden cover, exposing the black, gaping maw to the night sky. What happened next would be forever burned into Elias' memory, a scene of such macabre, unnatural horror that it defied all reason. Jedediah turned and walked back toward the cabin. He disappeared inside for a moment, then re-emerged, dragging something behind him. At first, Elias couldn't make it out. It was large and heavy. Then, as Jedediah dragged it into the lantern's glow, the horrifying truth became clear. It was the carcass of their milk cow, which had mysteriously died weeks before. Jedediah had kept the body. He dragged the dead animal to the edge of the well, and with a series of grunts and heaves, he began to push it in. The well was not wide enough. With a grim determination, Jedediah retrieved his axe and began the gruesome, methodical work of dismembering the carcass, hacking off limbs and dropping the pieces, one by one, into the pit. The sound, faint but sickening, carried on the wind. It was an offering, a sacrifice. Jedediah was feeding the well. He was trying to appease the entity with a substitute, a lesser gift, perhaps in the hopes of luring his family back. Or perhaps his mind was so far gone that he was simply following a set of ritualistic instructions whispered to him from the darkness below. Martha turned her head away, unable to watch, her body racked with silent, convulsive sobs. But Elias couldn't look away. He was transfixed by the sheer, calculated madness of it. His father, the devout, God-fearing man, was performing a blood sacrifice to a pagan entity, with his own daughter as his willing assistant. The last vestiges of the man they knew were gone, consumed entirely by the curse of the Holloway well. The gruesome ritual at the well continued for what felt like hours. After the last piece of the animal had been dropped into the abyss, Jedediah stood at the edge, his head bowed as if in prayer. Sarah stood beside him, patiently holding the light. They remained like that for a long time, two dark figures in a silent, unholy communion with the pit. In the rock shelter, a new and more immediate horror was dawning. The baby, Samuel, had not made a sound for over an hour. Martha, her fingers numb with cold, shifted the blankets to check on him. A low, guttural moan of pure anguish escaped her lips. In the darkness, Elias knew. He didn't need to see. The baby's unnatural stillness, the cessation of his weak whimpers, the chilling finality in his mother's cry, it was all the confirmation he needed. The cold, the stress, the wasting sickness that had plagued him for weeks, it had finally claimed him. Samuel was gone. Martha's grief was a terrible, silent thing. She rocked the small, cold body in her arms, her mind completely shattered. The escape had been for nothing. The last, most innocent member of the Holloway family had perished in a desperate flight from a man who had, in his own twisted way, been trying to sacrifice him anyway. The bitter, horrifying irony was a poison in Elias' soul. He felt a profound, soul-crushing emptiness. His brother was dead. His sister was a servant to a dark entity. His father was a monster. His mother was broken. Everything was lost. He looked back toward the well. The lantern was moving again. Jedediah and Sarah were walking away from the pit, heading back toward the cabin, but their pace was slow, meandering. They began to circle the clearing, Jedediah holding the lantern now, swinging it back and forth, casting long, dancing shadows. He was hunting. The offering had not been enough. The giver was not satisfied. And now he was coming for the rest of his family. The night of terror was far from over. The sight of his father beginning a systematic hunt jolted Elias from his grief-stricken stupor. The instinct to protect his mother, the last fragment of his life that wasn't tainted by madness, took over. He knew the rock shelter was a temporary refuge at best. Jedediah knew this land. He would check every overhang, every thicket. They had to move, and they had to be smart. He gently took the small, cold bundle from his mother's arms. Her eyes were vacant, unseeing. She was lost in a world of grief, barely responsive. "Mother," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Mother, we have to go now, he's coming." There was no recognition. He knew he couldn't carry her and run. He had to find a better hiding place, a place Jedediah might overlook. His mind raced, scanning the dark landscape. He remembered a place from their first weeks in the hollow, a place he and Sarah had discovered while exploring. It was a massive, ancient oak tree that had been struck by lightning years ago and had fallen, creating a hollow, cavernous log, now overgrown with thorny vines. It was nearly a quarter-mile away, a desperate trek, but it was their only chance. He took his mother by the arm and pulled her to her feet. She moved like an automaton, her feet shuffling listlessly through the snow. Carrying the body of his infant brother, Elias half-dragged, half-guided his catatonic mother through the treacherous woods, his eyes constantly scanning the darkness behind them for the telltale swing of a lantern. The journey was a nightmare. Thorns tore at their clothes and skin. The cold was a physical pain. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into the shape of his father. Finally, he saw it, the dark, immense shape of the fallen oak. He cleared away some of the thorny branches from the opening of the hollow log and helped his mother crawl inside. It was a cramped, dark, earthy-smelling space, but it was out of the wind, and most importantly, it was hidden. He laid Samuel's body down gently, then crawled in beside his mother, pulling the thorny branches back over the opening. He peered through a small gap, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, and waited for the light of his father's lantern to appear. From within the claustrophobic darkness of the hollow log, the world was reduced to sounds and the small sliver of clearing visible through the thorns. Elias listened, his senses strained to their absolute limit. He could hear his mother's soft, rhythmic weeping, a sound that was almost as terrifying as the silence of the woods. And then he heard another sound, footsteps, slow, deliberate crunching in the snow. They were close. A swinging light cut through the trees, playing across the thorny vines that concealed them. Jedediah was there. He was just outside their hiding place. Elias held his breath, his entire body rigid. He could hear his father's low muttering, a continuous, insane stream of conversation with an unseen partner. "They are close," Jedediah whispered to the darkness. "The giver can smell them. He knows his property. They cannot hide from him." The light swept directly over the log, and for a heart-stopping moment it paused. Elias was certain he had been found. He braced himself for the tearing of branches, for the face of his father to appear in the opening. But then the light moved on. Jedediah continued his patrol, his footsteps receding into the distance. Elias let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, his body trembling with relief. But the relief was short-lived. A new, more disturbing sound reached him. It was singing. A child's voice, high and clear, cutting through the night. It was Sarah. She was chanting the dissonant, meandering tune she always hummed by the well. She was out there with him, helping him hunt. She was a living beacon, a tool of the entity guiding her father. The footsteps stopped again, this time farther away. Then came Jedediah's voice, raised in a booming, terrifying proclamation that echoed through the hollow. "Martha, Elias, the offering was not enough. The giver is displeased. He demands the covenant be honored. Come out and receive your blessing. Come to the water." It was the call of a mad preacher summoning his flock. Elias knew it was a trap, but he also knew his father would not stop until he found them. They were trapped in a log, in a cursed hollow, hunted by a monster and his clairvoyant sister, with the long, freezing night still ahead of them. The hours crept by with agonizing slowness. Dawn was still a distant promise. The cold inside the log was profound, seeping deep into their bones. Martha had finally cried herself into a state of exhausted, semi-conscious lethargy. Elias fought to stay awake, knowing that sleep could mean freezing to death or worse, being discovered. The sounds of his father's hunt continued intermittently throughout the night. A distant shout, the crunch of snow, Sarah's chilling, ethereal singing. It was a relentless psychological assault. Sometime in the darkest hour before dawn, a new sound began. It was a rhythmic, percussive noise. A dull, heavy thudding followed by a grating scrape. Thud, scrape, thud, scrape. It was coming from the direction of the cabin and the well. Elias couldn't imagine what could be making the noise. It sounded like work, like some kind of heavy manual labor. The sound was deeply unsettling, not just for its strangeness, but for its methodical, tireless persistence. It went on, a horrifying industrial heartbeat in the center of the cursed hollow. What was he doing? Was he digging? Was he building something? The possibilities that ran through Elias' mind were all terrifying. He imagined his father constructing some kind of macabre altar, or digging a grave, or worse. The sound was an audible testament to Jedediah's madness, a madness fueled by a sleepless, inhuman energy. The entity in the well was not just poisoning his mind, it was fueling his body, turning him into a tireless instrument of its will. As the first pale, gray light of dawn began to break, the thudding finally stopped. A heavy, profound silence fell over the hollow once more. It was a silence that felt even more menacing than the noise it replaced. The work, whatever it was finished. Elias peered through the vines, his eyes straining in the dim light. He could see his father, a lone, dark figure, standing motionless beside the well. He was waiting. The horrifying realization dawned on Elias. The night of terror was merely a prelude. The true horror was being saved for the light of day. With the arrival of dawn's bleak light, a desperate plan formed in Elias' mind. He could not stay hidden forever. His mother was unresponsive, and he knew she would not survive another day in the freezing cold without help. The outside world, the world of settlements and sanity, was their only hope. He estimated the nearest trading post was at least a day's walk, a near impossible journey in their condition, but it was the only option left. He had to leave his mother and the body of his brother, and he had to run for help. It was a terrible choice, leaving her alone and vulnerable, but staying meant certain death for them both. He whispered his plan to his mother, not knowing if she could even hear or understand him. He told her he would be back, that he would bring people, that they would be safe. He covered her with his own jacket, a futile gesture against the deep cold, and then with a heavy heart he prepared to leave. He waited, watching his father, who still stood like a statue by the well. He needed a diversion, a window of opportunity to slip away unnoticed. He prayed for a moment when his father's back would be turned. The opportunity never came. Jedediah seemed to be in a trance, his gaze fixed on the well as if awaiting instructions. Elias knew he couldn't wait any longer. He took a deep, steadying breath and slowly, silently, began to crawl out of the hollow log. He moved with agonizing slowness, making sure not a single twig snapped, not a single leaf rustled. He was halfway out when Sarah's voice, clear as a bell, rang out from across the clearing. "He's there," she screamed, her voice devoid of any sisterly affection, filled only with the cold glee of a predator spotting its prey. "In the fallen oak. He's trying to run." Elias froze, his blood turning to ice. Jedediah's head snapped up, his eyes locking directly onto the log. For a long moment they just stared at each other across the snow-covered clearing, the mad father and the terrified son. Then Jedediah's face broke into a slow, terrible smile. He raised his axe, which Elias now saw was stained with dirt and something darker, and began to walk, slowly and deliberately, toward the log. The hunt was over. The final confrontation was at hand. There was no more time for stealth, no more hope for a quiet escape. Elias scrambled out of the log and ran. He didn't look back. He just ran, fueled by pure, unadulterated terror. He could hear his father's heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush behind him, accompanied by a low, guttural roar of fury. This wasn't a chase to capture. It was a chase to kill. Elias was younger, faster, and his small frame allowed him to dart through the dense woods more easily than his larger father. He burst out of the tree line and into a small, rocky clearing, desperate to put as much distance as possible between them. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw his father emerge from the woods, his face a mask of primal rage, the axe held high. But Jedediah was not looking at him. His gaze was fixed on something else, something to Elias' left. Elias followed his father's gaze and saw Sarah. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, effectively cutting off his escape route in that direction. She wasn't threatening him physically, but her presence was a strategic, terrifying move. She was herding him. Like a sheepdog, she was guiding the prey back toward the hunter. He was trapped between the madman with the axe and the clairvoyant child. His only path was forward, deeper into the hollow, a direction he desperately wanted to avoid because he knew where it led. It led back toward the homestead. Back toward the well. A horrifying realization washed over him. This wasn't just a chase. This was a carefully orchestrated hunt, a ritual. They weren't just trying to kill him. They were trying to drive him to a specific location. They were driving him toward the altar. With a sob of despair, he scrambled forward, his feet finding the faint imprint of the path that led back to the cabin. He was running right back into the heart of the nightmare, but it was the only path they had left open for him. The horrifying sounds of his father's pursuit and his sister's encouraging shouts echoed behind him, a macabre chorus luring him to his doom. Running on pure adrenaline, Elias burst back into the main clearing where the cabin stood. The scene that greeted him was one of calculated, industrial horror. The source of the strange, rhythmic thudding he'd heard throughout the night was now terrifyingly clear. Jedediah had spent the night constructing a crude but effective derrick over the well, made from lashed timbers and a rope and pulley system. A large, reinforced bucket was attached to the rope. His father hadn't been digging a grave, he'd been building a machine, an instrument for his ritual. At the base of the derrick, near the well's opening, sat a small, crudely made wooden chair, and tied to the chair, her body slumped in defeat, was his mother, Martha. Jedediah must have found her after he left the log, dragging her back to be the centerpiece of his final, horrifying ceremony. She was alive, but her eyes were vacant, staring into nothingness. She was a prisoner, a witness, and likely the next intended sacrifice. Sarah stood beside the chair, her hand resting on her mother's shoulder, not in a comforting gesture but in the manner of a guard. The entire scene was a meticulously arranged stage for a macabre play, and Elias had just been forced to take his position. He stumbled to a halt, his lungs burning, his mind reeling from the sheer, premeditated insanity of it all. Jedediah entered the clearing behind him, breathing heavily but with a look of grim satisfaction on his face. He no longer looked like a frantic madman, he looked like a master of ceremonies whose final guest had just arrived. "Welcome home, my son," Jedediah said, his voice unnervingly calm. "You are just in time. The giver is waiting. It is time to purify this family. It is time to wash ourselves in the sacred water." He gestured with his axe toward the well, toward the crude derrick, toward the captive Martha. Elias understood now. The machine wasn't for lowering offerings. It was for lowering people. He was not meant to be a sacrifice. He was meant to be the instrument. "You will do the work of the giver, Elias," Jedediah commanded, his voice ringing with absolute authority. He pointed the axe at the derrick's crank. "Your mother has lost her faith. She must be cleansed. She must be reborn in the cold water. You will lower her. You will be the hands of our salvation." This was the ultimate, most twisted act of his father's madness. He wouldn't simply murder his family. He would force his son to be his accomplice, to be the executioner. He wanted to shatter Elias' soul, to make him a participant in the horror, to bind him to the well's curse forever. Elias stood frozen, his mind unable to process the monstrous demand. He looked at his mother, a shell of the woman she once was, tied to a chair awaiting a horrifying fate. He looked at his sister, her face a blank mask of zealous complicity. And he looked at his father, a man so thoroughly possessed by an evil entity that he saw this abomination as a holy sacrament. In that moment, something inside Elias broke. The terror and grief that had paralyzed him for days finally coalesced into a single, burning point of pure, cold rage. "No," Elias said, his voice quiet but filled with a steely resolve he didn't know he possessed. "Never." Jedediah's calm facade shattered, his face contorted in fury. "You disobedient child," he roared. "You defy our salvation. Then you will be the first to receive the blessing." He lunged at Elias, the axe raised high. But Elias was ready. He had been a victim for too long. As Jedediah charged, Elias dove to the side, grabbing a large, heavy piece of firewood from the stack near the cabin wall. He came up swinging, his movements clumsy but fueled by a desperate, righteous fury. He swung the log like a club, connecting solidly with Jedediah's knee. There was a sickening crack and Jedediah screamed, a sound of pure pain, and collapsed to the ground, the axe clattering beside him. Elias didn't hesitate. He stood over his father, the log raised, ready to strike again. A boy pushed to the absolute edge of his humanity, about to commit the ultimate sin to end the ultimate evil. The dynamic in the clearing had shifted in a heartbeat. Jedediah, the monstrous patriarch, was now a wounded animal, writhing on the ground, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. Elias stood over him, a heavy log in his hands, his chest heaving, his mind a battlefield of horror, rage, and a sliver of terrifying triumph. For a moment he saw not his father but the entity that had stolen him, and he wanted to smash it, to obliterate it from the face of the earth. But he couldn't. Despite everything, the face contorted in pain on the ground was still his father's. As Elias hesitated, Sarah acted. She let out a piercing shriek of rage and charged at him, her small hands balled into fists, her face a mask of fury. "You hurt him," she screamed. "You hurt the prophet." She was a child, but her attack was ferocious, a whirlwind of scratching and biting. The surprise and the ferocity of her assault knocked Elias off balance. He stumbled backward, dropping the log. As he fought to push his sister away, Jedediah, groaning, began to drag himself across the ground. He wasn't reaching for the axe. He was crawling with a single-minded, desperate purpose toward the well. He reached the edge of the pit, his broken leg trailing uselessly behind him, and peered down into the darkness. "Forgive my son's transgression, my lord," he whimpered, his voice a pathetic, broken plea. "He is weak. I will make it right. I will give you a better offering, a willing offering." With a final, agonizing effort, he pulled himself up over the stone lip of the well. He turned his head, his eyes finding Elias one last time. There was no madness in them now, only a look of serene, ecstatic certainty. "I will be the first," he whispered. "I will prepare the way." And then he let go. He tipped himself forward and vanished into the black, silent maw of the well. There was no scream, only a heavy, sickening splash that echoed up from the depths, a sound of final, horrifying consumption. The sound of the splash hung in the cold morning air, a horrifying punctuation mark on Jedediah's madness. An unnatural silence descended upon the clearing. Elias stood, stunned, unable to comprehend what he had just witnessed. His father, the cause of all their suffering, was gone, having offered himself to the very entity he served. Sarah, her attack forgotten, simply stared at the well, her expression unreadable. She then turned, walked back to her mother's chair, and with a strange, detached calm began to untie the ropes. The immediate threat was gone, but the horror remained, a thick, poisonous atmosphere that clung to everything. Elias ran to his mother, who was now free but still locked in her catatonic state. "Mother, we have to go," he urged, his voice desperate. "It's over. We can leave now." But Martha didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the well, a look of profound, soul-deep terror etched onto her features. She began to tremble, a low moan escaping her lips. "It's not over," she whispered, her voice a dry, rattling husk. "He isn't gone, he's just with it now. Can't you hear it?" Elias listened. At first there was nothing but the wind, but then he heard it. A new sound coming from the depths of the well. It wasn't the sound of water or scraping stones. It was a voice, a low, gurgling whisper that was disturbingly familiar yet horribly changed. It was his father's voice, but distorted, layered, as if it were speaking through water and earth. It was chanting, repeating a single sibilant word over and over again. And beneath it another sound, a wet, rhythmic, pulsing sound like a giant subterranean heart starting to beat. The entity in the well was not a silent, waiting thing. It was awake, it had been fed, and it was now speaking with the voice of its newest servant. Jedediah's sacrifice hadn't ended the curse, it had consummated it. He had merged with the entity, becoming a permanent part of its malevolent consciousness. The true, horrifying nature of the Holloway well was finally revealing itself. The gurgling, chanting voice from the well was the final catalyst that shattered the last remnants of Martha's sanity. Her eyes widened in ultimate terror, and she let out a scream that was not human, a raw, piercing shriek of a soul pushed beyond the brink of all endurance. She scrambled to her feet, and before Elias could react, she ran. She did not run away from the well. She ran directly toward it. "I'm coming, Jedediah," she screamed, her voice a terrifying mix of love and madness. "Wait for me." Elias lunged, tackling her just a few feet from the well's edge. They fell to the ground in a desperate struggle. Martha fought with the unnatural strength of the insane, her nails clawing at his face, her teeth snapping. She was no longer his mother. She was a creature consumed by a singular, horrifying desire to join her husband in the cold, dark water. As they wrestled on the ground, Sarah simply stood and watched, her expression one of placid curiosity, as if observing a fascinating, natural phenomenon. The chanting from the well grew louder, more insistent, a siren song of mud and decay calling to its followers. It was Jedediah's voice, calling for his wife, promising her release, promising her a place in his new, dark kingdom. "Let me go," Martha shrieked, her voice growing hoarse. "He's waiting for me. We have to be a family again." Elias held on, his muscles straining, tears of grief and terror streaming down his face. He was in an impossible situation, fighting to save his mother from her own suicidal, grief-driven madness, while the corrupted voice of his dead father beckoned her into an abyss from which there was no return. This scene, more than any other, encapsulates the utter devastation wrought by the curse. It didn't just kill, it inverted and perverted the most sacred human bonds, turning love into a death wish and family into a horrifying trap. These are the kinds of disturbing histories that are often erased from the records. To ensure these stories of forbidden lore and dark cold cases are not forgotten, take a moment to subscribe. What follows is the final, chilling resolution of the Holloway tragedy. Elias knew he couldn't hold his mother for long. Her frantic strength was beginning to overwhelm him. He needed to get her away from the well, away from the sound of that horrifying, persuasive voice. With a surge of adrenaline, he managed to drag her backward, away from the pit, pulling her toward the tree line, toward the path that led out of the hollow. She continued to fight him, her screams echoing in the clearing, a duet with the gurgling whispers from the well. He was losing. He was exhausted, and she was relentless. It was then that Sarah, who had been a silent observer, finally moved. She walked slowly to the derrick her father had built. She picked up the heavy, reinforced bucket, and with a calm, deliberate motion she began to lower it into the well. The rope unspooled with a soft, whirring sound. "What are you doing?" Elias screamed at her, his attention divided between his struggling mother and his eerily calm sister. Sarah didn't answer. She just continued to lower the bucket until the rope went slack. Then she began to pull it back up, hand over hand, the pulley groaning under the weight. It was heavy, much heavier than a bucket of water. Elias watched, his blood running cold as the bucket rose from the darkness. As it cleared the lip of the well, he could see what was inside. It was not water. The bucket was filled to the brim with the same black, fibrous, hair-like muck from the bottom of the pit. And nestled within it were the round, smooth, dark stones they had found when they first dug the well. The stones he had dreamt were eyes. But there was something else. Protruding from the muck was a single, pale object. It was a human jawbone. Sarah set the bucket down and began to calmly, methodically, lay the contents out on the ground, arranging the stones and the bones into a deliberate, ritualistic pattern. She was not just a servant of the well. She was its high priestess, preparing the altar for the next phase of the ceremony. The sight of the bones of Sarah's profane ritual was the final, horrifying straw. Elias found a last reservoir of strength. He managed to subdue his mother, pinning her arms as she sobbed hysterically. "Look away, mother," he pleaded. "Don't look at it." But it was too late. Both of them were transfixed by Sarah's macabre work. She arranged the stones in a circle, and in the center she placed the jawbone. Then she dipped her hands into the black muck from the bucket and began to smear it on her face, her arms, and her clothes, all while humming her terrible, tuneless song. The voice from the well fell silent. A new sound replaced it, a low, powerful vibration that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. The water in the well began to churn, to bubble, not like boiling water, but like thick, cold mud. The pulsing grew stronger, and the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. In that moment of supernatural terror, Martha went limp in Elias' arms, her mind finally and completely snapping. She passed out, a small mercy in the face of the encroaching horror. Elias, alone and terrified, knew he had seconds to act. He scooped his mother into his arms. She was terrifyingly light, and without a second look at his sister or the pulsating well, he ran. He ran as he had never run before, his legs pumping, his lungs screaming for air. He ran through the tree line, away from the clearing, away from the cabin, away from the curse. Behind him, he heard a sound he would be unable to describe for the rest of his life. It was a deep, wet, tearing sound, as if the earth itself were splitting open. It was followed by a high, thin scream, Sarah's voice, but her scream was not one of terror. It was a scream of ecstatic, terrible triumph. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He just kept running, leaving Shadow Creek Hollow and its unspeakable secrets behind him forever. Elias ran until his legs gave out, until his lungs felt like they were on fire. He finally collapsed at the edge of a shallow creek, miles from the hollow, the sun high in the sky. His mother was still unconscious, her breathing shallow. He had escaped, but he was a refugee from a forgotten war, a survivor of a massacre that left only spiritual and psychological scars. He spent the next 2 days carrying his mother through the wilderness, surviving on nuts and his own sheer, indomitable will to live. He finally stumbled upon the cabin of a hunter, a kind man who took them in, fed them, and asked no questions, seeing the profound, unspeakable trauma in the boy's eyes. Martha Holloway never recovered. She would live for another 3 years in the care of a distant relative, a silent, hollow-eyed woman who never spoke another word, who would sometimes trace circles in the air with her finger and weep silently. She died in her sleep, finally free from the memories that had destroyed her. Elias, too, was forever changed. He grew into a quiet, solitary man who avoided deep woods and the sound of running water. He never spoke of what happened in the hollow, not in detail. The horrifying memories were a forbidden country in his mind, a place he walled off and never visited. The official record, if one was ever made, would have been simple. The Holloway family, pioneers in the Ozark territory, vanished in the winter of 1799. Lost to the harshness of the frontier, a common enough tale. The land was eventually sold, but no one ever settled in Shadow Creek Hollow again. It retained its name, a place of bad reputation that locals instinctively avoided without knowing the full, horrifying reason why. The story was lost, buried under the weight of time and the desire to forget. But the story of the Holloway well was not truly over. Its most disturbing chapter was yet to be discovered. Years later, in 1824, a team of surveyors mapping the expanding territory for the government pushed deep into the Ozark frontier. Their maps led them into a quiet, unsettlingly still hollow. They found the ruins of a cabin, long since collapsed, and a circle of stones in the earth that was clearly an old well. One of the surveyors, a man of scientific curiosity, noted the strange geology and insisted on examining the well. The local guide, a man of Cherokee descent, warned them against it, speaking of old stories about the place, calling it unclean. The surveyors, men of logic and reason, scoffed. With ropes and grappling hooks, they began the arduous process of clearing the well, which appeared to have been intentionally filled in with massive rocks and debris. After days of work, they cleared the blockage. What they found at the bottom was not a source of water, but the source of a forbidden, macabre legend. There, preserved in the cold, anaerobic mud, was a horrifying tableau. They found the skeletal remains of a large man with a shattered leg, his bones intermingled with those of a cow. But there was more. The well was a mass grave, containing dozens of other skeletons, men, women, and children, many of them bearing the marks of ritual sacrifice. Some skeletons were ancient, belonging to the Native American tribes that had inhabited the land for centuries. Others were more recent, likely lone hunters or lost travelers who had the misfortune of stumbling upon the hollow. The entity in the well, it seemed, had been thirsty for a very, very long time. Jedediah Holloway was not its first priest, merely its most recent. The surveyors, deeply disturbed by their discovery, documented their findings in a private report. They sealed the well permanently, this time with blasting powder and tons of rock, erasing it from the landscape. The official map they submitted had a conspicuous blank space where the hollow was, and their report was classified, buried in government archives, deemed too disturbing and inflammatory for public knowledge. The curse of the Holloway well was officially, and intentionally, banned from history. The story you have just heard is not one you will find in any official history book. It has been pieced together from fragmented sources. A classified geological survey report from 1824, the disjointed deathbed ramblings of a man named Elias Holloway in 1852, and the persistent, whispered folklore of the Ozark Hills. It is a story that history has actively tried to forget. Why? Because it confronts us with a deeply unsettling possibility, that there are places in this world where the veil between our reality and something other, something ancient and malevolent, is terrifyingly thin. The entity in the Holloway well, what was it? A geological phenomenon that caused hallucinations, a pocket of natural gas, or was it something more? Something sentient, patient, and predatory? The evidence points toward a horrifying conclusion. The discovery of multiple skeletons from different eras, all showing signs of ritualistic sacrifice, suggests a pattern, a repeating cycle of horror. The well, or the spring it tapped into, was a focal point of a dark, terrestrial intelligence that would periodically awaken, find a susceptible mind like Jedediah's, and use him as an instrument to feed its unnatural hunger. The curse was not specific to the Holloways. They were simply the latest victims in a long, blood-soaked history. Jedediah's madness was not born of isolation. It was a psychic infection. Sarah was not communicating with an imaginary friend. She was a conduit for an ancient, hungry consciousness. The entire tragedy was a preordained cycle, a macabre harvest that had occurred time and time again in the cursed silence of Shadow Creek Hollow. The thought that such places might exist, dormant and waiting, is a deeply disturbing one. It challenges our modern, rational understanding of the world and suggests that some legends are not just stories, they are warnings. The legacy of the Holloway well is one of silence and absence. The hollow itself remains unmarked on modern maps, a geographical ghost. The land is part of a vast national forest now, and it is likely that hikers and hunters have passed through it, completely unaware of the horrifying history slumbering beneath their feet. They might notice the unnatural quiet, the strange chill in the air, or the distinct lack of wildlife, but they would dismiss it as nothing more than a strange quirk of the landscape. They would be walking over a sealed tomb, an unmarked grave for dozens of souls, and the prison of an ancient, malevolent entity. What became of Sarah? Her fate remains the story's most chilling mystery. Elias saw her last as a willing priestess at the well's edge, screaming in triumph. Did she join her father and mother in the well? Or did she become the new guardian of the hollow, a feral, insane hermit living in the woods, waiting for the entity's next awakening? Some local, more obscure legends speak of a white witch of Shadow Creek, a pale, wild woman seen flitting through the trees on moonless nights, humming a strange, tuneless song. It is likely just folklore, a ghost story to frighten children. But in the context of the Holloway tragedy, the possibility is terrifying. The thought of Sarah, forever bound to the will of the man in the water, a timeless sentinel for a sleeping evil, is perhaps the most macabre outcome of all. Her innocence wasn't just lost, it was weaponized, turned into a permanent instrument of the very horror that destroyed her family. These are the kinds of disturbing loose ends and cold cases that haunt the dark corners of history. And if you believe these stories need to be told, your support helps us to continue unearthing them. In the end, the horrifying curse of the Holloway well serves as a chilling reminder of the vast, unknown wilderness that was the American frontier, not just a wilderness of trees and mountains, but of faith, fear, and the terrifying fragility of the human mind. Jedediah Holloway went into the Ozarks seeking a kingdom, but all he found was a pre-existing one, a dark dominion that had been waiting patiently in the cold earth. He thought he was a pioneer, a master of his own destiny, but he was merely a pawn, a key turned in an ancient, forbidden lock. The well is sealed now, buried under tons of government-blasted rock forgotten by maps and memory. But the questions remain, hanging in the still, heavy air of that lost hollow. Is the entity truly imprisoned, or is it merely sleeping, waiting? The water that fed it still flows, deep in the bedrock of the Ozarks. Perhaps it seeps into other springs, other creeks, carrying its psychic poison to new, unsuspecting places. The curse of the Holloway well may not have been an isolated event. It may simply be the only time we have a record of it. The most terrifying thought is not what happened to the Holloway family in 1799, but how many other families, in how many other isolated places, have stumbled upon such a thirsty spring and simply vanished, their stories untold, their screams swallowed by the wilderness. The next time you find yourself in a place of profound, unnatural silence, you might ask yourself, what is sleeping beneath your feet, and is it thirsty?